What's up, SOBs? Welcome back to Stream of Blood, where we are doing our Hero Instant Debrief. I have with me Andy Ashcraft. He has a game company called Giantsdance Games. He's the creator of video games, board games, and the tabletop role-playing game we played recently in our lab show, the Hero Instant, which was really cool kind of superhero game that really captured I don't know, the narrative beats of a comic book or superhero story. I also thought it worked so incredibly well for using in-universe things, like adapting the DC universe. So that was a lot of fun. Andy, welcome. Thanks for coming on the show and talking to us a little bit about your design process.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk about my game designs to strangers, to loved ones, to anyone, basically anyone with ears.
Right. I mean, do you just kind of lay in bed at night with your loved one and kind of whisper your game design tips into her ear?
Yeah.
That's what I do with my wife too, and she's asked me to stop.
I'm thinking about trauma traits.
Yeah. So before we get into like your specific design and everything, I always like to give people a little background on somebody. What is the game that got you hooked on gaming? And I don't think it has to be a role-playing game, even though that's kind of what we're here to talk about today, but it might have been a video game or a board game. What's the game that got you hooked?
Well, it turns out it was D&D.
Oh, yeah.
It was a role-playing game. I wandered into my high school library. I was a freshman in high school and saw some kids, one of whom I knew, playing this game, sitting around the table in a library playing this game. And I sat down with them, and they invited me to play. And they were playing Dungeons and Dragons. They were running Tomb of Horror.
Oh, wow.
Right.
I just ran the Tomb of Horror, and it's very tough. That's a tough module.
It's really tough. I don't think we survived it. But
Yeah.
I can tell you the exact moment that this game hooked itself into my brain, because I remember it so vividly, even though it's like 40 years ago, right?
Sure.
This game. So we were playing, and there's a moment where you go into this little side room off the main corridor. As soon as you sort of get past the little entryway and you get into the main corridor, there's a little side room, and there's a demon shackled to the wall, and you fight the demon. And there's a picture of the demon in the book, and the GM showed us the picture of the demon in the book. And after the fight was over, we defeated the demon. It's not a particularly hard fight. He said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to look inside the urn." And he looked through the notes, and he's like, "There's no urn listed." But I said, "But there's one in the picture."
Right.
And
yeah, totally.
And he said, "Oh, okay." And he rolled some dice, and he said, "You find a silver sword." And at that moment, it was like, "Oh, this is the meaty, juicy bit of this, where the GM just listens to the players' ideas and responds to that."
That's very cool, and it's that kind of interaction between dice and rules and imagination that makes a good role-playing game. Do you remember what edition of D&D that was?
It was AD&D. It was like
yeah. I love that. I love that idea that so the picture it's canon. It's in the book.
It's canon.
Let me do it.
Right.
Wow. Yeah, that's a true old D&D story. I think that there are arguments that those older versions of D&D kind of lended themselves to that a little more, because I wonder what you think of like the idea that now if we play 5e, I know that you've played plenty of 5e Dungeons and Dragons and ran it.
Yeah, I played some. I haven't played. I wouldn't say I've played plenty yet, but I've played some.
Okay. Do you mostly? I know that you have run some campaigns recently. Do you use 3.5 or Pathfinder? Or?
Well, I'm still running an Eberron campaign.
Oh, awesome!
Going on for 15 years.
Yes, that's amazing, and that's an amazing world, isn't it? It's such a great setting for D&D.
It's so good.
Yeah,
I'm gonna miss it. I'm trying to wrap the game up, because they're all like 19th level, and they're all basically superheroes, and they can do anything they want.
Right.
player characters because really third edition D&D really breaks down after like 12th level.
Yeah.
Like third through ninth is sort of the sweet spot, and then it gets really just sort of over the top.
Right. I have a 5e campaign that's been going 2 years, a little more than 2 years. And now the characters are 13th, and it's, finding things to challenge them is challenging for me, and it's my casual home game that I'm not streaming,
Yeah. And even though it's because 5e, I thought I haven't played a 5e game that's gone up to that high yet, but I thought that it was specifically designed to address this problem.
I think that 5e is an excellent product. I think D&D gets plenty of press and accolades. I think it's an excellent product. I do think that if I had to nitpick and find a criticism for it, and maybe it's telling that you think the same is true of 3.5 or whatever edition you're using. If there is an issue, it's that the players are superheroes pretty early, and you have to kind of, in my opinion, abandon their challenge rating system and kind of start making the players use judgment, which kind of ties into the question I was about to ask you, which is like, what do you think of the idea that like in old versions of D&D there was no investigation skill, or there wasn't even like a perception skill? So now when we play D&D or a lot of role-playing games, D&D is not the only one that does this. The characters, if they want to notice something or figure something out, they just roll a die, and if they succeed at the roll, well, you just give them the information. But in old school Dungeons and Dragons back in AD&D, when you got hooked, you really just were told the contents of a room, and you had to start poking and prodding things and telling the DM everything you were doing in that room. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is there something that you prefer, or?
Well, so I like that that we can play characters who are smarter than us.
Yes.
There's sort of an assumption in old school D&D that you're smarter than your characters.
Yeah.
Or you're exactly the same intelligence as your characters.
Yes.
So especially in superheroes where you can play like, Reed Richards and super scientists and people who are like literally superhumanly smart.
Right.
How do you get the players to that?
Right.
And honestly, I don't know that you can. Like, players are going to be players. They're going to be as smart as they're going to be. But they're normal human stats players, and they're playing, like it's like it's okay for somebody to play a character that's stronger than they are. Like nobody has any.
But for some reason, the intelligence had to come directly from the players. Yeah, there was less focus on creating a separate identity. I feel like,
It was, the original was not designed for that at all.
Yeah.
It was designed. I mean, the basic game loop is go into the dungeon, go as far as you can, get as much treasure as you can, go back to town, sell it, level up, stat up, go back into the dungeon with new supplies, potions and whatever you think you're going to need. Go as far as you can. That was the loop, right? That was
right.
It was like character. What, like, why do you care?
Sure. Yeah, it makes me think that. Yeah, it makes me think that that's an interesting way to play. I think it's also a valid way to play. I think just because I've done it the other way my entire gaming career or life, I might want to try it that way, that old school way sometime. But I see. I thank you for bringing up the advantages of sort of the way we do now, and I think there's also a happy medium. Probably you can probably like be roll for investigation. They get a success, and you give them a clue, not the answer, right? Like that, and let them make their own conclusions.
Right. Although there's I remember reading. I don't remember who wrote Gumshoe, but that guy is pretty smart about, because that game is just an investigation game. So it's a role-playing game just like focused on investigation. And his point was that you never want to actually prevent people from finding the information they need to keep the story going.
Right.
That'll kill a game faster than anything. That'll drag a game down to nothing, right?
Right.
So you basically, no matter what the players do, you come up as a GM, you come up with a reason for them to find the answer.
Right.
They're like, they come up with some stupid idea. I check under the bed. Well, guess what? It turns out the clue was under the bed.
Right. Well, I think that that's Robin D. Laws you're talking about.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
if anybody has never read his Robin's Laws of Good Game Mastering, I think it's cheap on Drive Through RPG. Everybody should read that book because it's a lot of good advice for game mastering. But yeah, I agree. I think that some game masters were doing that. They were kind of being like, okay, so the clue's under the bed now, and I just won't tell anybody, and nobody needs to know. And
Right.
and then some game masters were going, no, I want this to be a challenge. I want it to be hard. If they don't look in the urn, they don't find it. And I waffle, which it's you want to make the best session possible, but you also don't want to seem like a pushover, or like you're just walking them through a Disney ride that happens to be fantasy adventure themed, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I think that's again where the stats come in, right?
Yeah.
So the superhuman stats of let's go into the hero instance. So let's say you were playing Agent Bride and you've got a perception of 4. That's higher than the highest normal human can be. So if you say I'm gonna check under the bed, and it's a dumb idea, and then you roll really well on your score, then all of a sudden it became a very, very smart idea.
Yeah. Okay. I hear you.
Right.
Yeah.
So now as a game master, I say, oh my gosh, that was you find something that you check under the bed, and it turns out there's a little slice in the carpet, and you happen to find the slice in the carpet where they had tucked a note or whatever. They thought they had hidden it much better than they had, but you're super smart and you found it.
Well, this kind of goes to your entire philosophy, I think, behind the Hero Instant. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if we can just talk about the game for a moment, role playing is built into the character design. Your characters have to role play to get extra dice and re-rolls. So you've put the characters a little bit in charge of the narrative. So I think your game is designed on the principle very much that the world is not this static, objective thing, but that when the players enter it, they have a quantum foam around them that kind of affects the narrative,
Yeah, and I'm sort of on the fence on that. I'm not as far as some games take it. Like if you play Fate, where you actually have like narrative moments where you can just say, I'm going to spin this narrative chip and I'm going to say that there's a clue under the bed and I find it.
Right.
As a player, right? I don't go that far. I don't go that far into it, but I do want to take some of those ideas and sort of like incorporate them into something a little bit more traditional.
Yeah, and there seems to also be this kind of I don't want to say split, because I think there are people that play both types of games, but there's definitely people who prefer the more narrative, the story-based games like Fate or the Dungeon World series, where you're kind of, spending points and doing things to affect really things that used to be the purview of the game master. And then there's the more old school, like a simulationist or, the world is objective and your characters enter into it and you must interact with that. So, and then of course, every GM, I mean, I think every game master affects that spectrum as well, and where they are.
Well, you always fall somewhere in the midst, and you want to have. And honestly, when I think about good games, I think about there's sort of 3 things that make a game great.
Okay.
Right? A good GM, a game system that matches the GM style.
Yeah.
And basically willing players.
Yeah.
Good players, and so. 2 of the 3 and you've got an okay game.
Right.
1 of the 3 and it falls apart completely.
So it's interesting, we're here to talk about game design, and I think that maybe 2 of the things you just mentioned are all outside of the control of the designer, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As the designer, you really only have like, 1 to 33% of the
Yeah.
game on your shoulders.
And it's also telling, I think, when I look online and I look at when people are asking questions of each other on the various message boards, like, how do I run a better game, or how do I fix this problem on my game? I would say, I'd say 2/3 of the time they're asking, this player isn't doing what I
Right.
want him to do, or this GM didn't do it the way it's supposed to be done. And that
Right.
fills up billions and billions of words of, the internet conversation about this. And I'm
Yeah.
always like, oh, those are problems that the game can't solve for you. The designer can't solve for you.
Well, yes and no, right? Because there's the game and the design of the game. And the game design might be brilliant. It might be genius. But if it's not been explained well,
Yeah.
nobody's going to find that genius.
Right.
And so the real strength of a game designer is their ability to communicate. Like the ideas are fine. Like having the great ideas to make a game really work is part of it. But another big part of being a GM is that communicative part, the ability to communicate what's cool about this thing. You've made this awesome thing. What's cool about it? How do people find out the cool stuff? How do they get to
Right.
the cool stuff and understand the cool stuff so that maybe the game itself will actually modify the GM's their style, or maybe your GM is mature enough and flexible enough to modify their own style to match the game if they know what the game is actually asking them to do.
Right. And so the designer has to be so clear and communicative of what the game is intended to do, right?
Yeah,
Um
yeah,
and then the GM has to be smart enough to pick up on it. But yeah, clear
yeah.
communication
And the
from that
players,
designer.
and the players too, right? The players. So in that sense, I'll go back to my 33%. Now the game designer has more responsibility into their 33%. Like the game
Yeah.
master 33% kind of relies on the game designer
Right.
communicating the game to them well enough for them to run it.
Yeah.
And the
And
players,
and the players as well. I mean, the designer is also communicating to the players. I'd say, especially in something like D&D, where I think a lot of the players pour over that player's handbook, and sometimes they pour. I know I was running games for kids, D&D games for kids, and there were kids who had poured over the monster manual and would
oh yeah,
correct me about what the monster's powers were, and we're constantly trying to guess what the monster was so that they could, have an advantage. And
oh yeah.
uh, I told those kids that they were cheating, and no, if it's
You're
part of the
playing
fun,
wrong.
yeah, you're playing it wrong. No, it is funny though. It is funny how you've got to communicate to the players as well with this. So the designer, I'll give him more than 33% when you factor that in. Yeah.
Yeah.
But speaking of like cool, simple communication, the thing I really loved, I think I liked a lot of things about the hero system. The thing I loved more than anything else were your attributes. That you have these like really beautifully, sort of, I don't say broad or wide encompassing attributes, and you have them in pairs where there's the active and the kind of like defensive side. So in Hero Instant, you had a perception score and a stealth score, an aim score and a dodge score, a strength and a toughness score,
Yeah.
influence and self-control. So anytime I'm having a character roll influence, I know if someone's opposing him, he's going to roll self-control. And I also thought it was really good for superheroes who have such a wide range of powers and abilities that they bring, but any kind of superpower still fits under one of these headings, doesn't it? Like toughness, a force field fits under toughness ultimately. And teleportation fits under dodge.
Yep.
Really.
Kind
so
of.
Tell me about how you came up with that and like what your philosophy was there. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I have this rule of 5, and it has to do with the number of things that people can hold in their heads easily.
Yeah.
And so, like phone numbers, the reason we have like the dashes between the phone number, like between the first 3 and the last 4 digits of our phone numbers, is because it's easy to remember a 3-digit number and a 4-digit number, but it's hard to remember a 7-digit number.
Right.
And that's because of our brain gets, most of the time, most of us adult humans have a match of about 5 things you can remember at one time and sort of keep organized in your head. And
Right.
so it turns out 5 stats isn't really quite enough to do what I wanted to do.
Right.
But 4 stats split in half allowed it to fit within that sort of, it's 4 stats really. So it's easy to remember what they are. And
you know what's funny is that's more stats than you'd find in Dungeons and Dragons. There are 6 attributes in Dungeons and Dragons, but I feel like players would have an easier time remembering these and what they do because of what you've done. You have 8, but you've split them into those 2 columns so that you can see what opposes what. I just feel like, for whatever reason, it's technically, I guess, more stats, but it's more memorable.
Yeah, and you know what? I actually, I started thinking about stats this way, or started thinking about how stats are organized like this when I first saw my first White Wolf game. Mm-hmm. Because you remember how in the World of Darkness and the White Wolf games, you've got basically 3 sets of 3. Right? Is that right? I think that's right.
In White Wolf, 3 sets of 3. Well, I know that there's the physical, mental, and social.
Yeah, that's right.
Divided up. Yeah,
and each one has basically got a physical prowess, or like a power stat.
Yep.
A finesse stat and a defense stat.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. This is very explicitly stated in the new World of Darkness books that came out in the early 2000s. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the 1990s, I saw that and was like, oh, that's actually really smart. And you can even imagine, like, you could add other categories too. Like if you were doing some sort of political game, like, well, I mean, a lot of those games were very political, but you could really have another column of things, right? You could have a political, like, strength, finesse, toughness,
right?
Or some sort of alien. I don't know. You can imagine some other category of.
You could go crazy. Cooking. Let's say your game is about cooking. You could have a power stat, a finesse stat, and a what do you call I don't know what the resistance stat would mean. But you could figure it out.
Right. How do people attack each other cooking wise? Then like, oh, well, all right. It might be some sort of ego stat.
Like, it is funny, power, finesse, and resistance still feels like combat oriented. And it's funny how all role-playing games sort of have this war game DNA. And even something as abstracted and, like you say, political as White Wolf games, power, finesse, and resistance is still very much, well, I think it's because conflict is at the heart of role-playing games too, probably.
Right. So when you're designing so this goes back to sort of the broad questions you want to ask yourself when you're designing a game. Is like, what's the conflict? What kind of conflicts are the players going to get into? And make sure that your game makes those conflicts interesting.
Right.
Like, I honestly think that you guys had as much fun rescuing people out of the flood in that first episode than you did fighting the giant rats.
Right. Yeah, and that's interesting too, because I think that when I think about role-playing games, I sometimes think I have my favorite sessions don't involve fighting and combat. Maybe it's because I've played a lot of them, so I've had a lot of fights and combats, and sometimes if you don't have a great GM, or I'm not at the top of my game as the GM, they start to feel kind of samey. The fights. I hit you, you hit me.
That's
something like saving people from a flood, it feels like a more unique experience for sure.
Yeah, the very first game that I ran, because I knew that I knew, because I played a lot of Champions and I played some other superhero games, but I played a lot of Champions. And so I knew that there would be fighting, but I wanted to test how other parts of the game worked. So my
Yeah.
very first playtest of this game, 7 years ago, was rescuing people from a house in the middle of farmlands as a tornado is tearing down on them.
Yeah.
And so
That's really cool.
yeah, and it worked, and it works, and I'm like, okay, I think this is going to actually work then.
It also makes it makes the players rather be creative, because if I'm playing Cyclops and I know that my powers, I can blast things with my, laser vision, how do I save people from a tornado that's bearing down on their house? What can I do to help with that? Now, I think a lazy player or maybe just an inexperienced one would be like, well, I can't do anything. There's nothing to shoot. But there's definitely something you could do with like helping to create earthworks, and you know what I mean? Like,
For sure.
getting into houses. I don't know. Like, there's all kinds of options, but you have to use your creativity. And that's the whole point of an RPG to me.
Yeah, that's right. And so before the session, before we actually turned on record here, you and I were talking about episode design. And I think this is a segue into that episode design idea. Like, my episode design for the second half of the game was, I'm going to put the portal at the bottom of a river.
Yeah.
I don't know how they're going to figure this out.
Yeah.
I don't know how they're going to solve this problem.
We'll see.
You guys to figure that out. And so I don't really, when I design these things, what I try not to do is design the solution.
Right. Well, that's yeah.
Into it.
That's very important. Yeah. And I forget it all the time, honestly, when I'm designing my episodes. But something that helped me was this book called Encounter Theory by Ben Riggs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and he's just saying what you just said, Andy, but he's saying it in a bunch of different ways and applying it to a bunch of different examples. But and he's saying it very clearly so a GM can understand and apply it. But basically, like, you present a situation. You don't present a situation and its solution and tell the players incorrect until they find the solution you've decided is the solution.
Right. And that goes back to the clue finding, right? I mean, that applies directly to the idea of like how do you go into the room where the murder scene has happened and you're trying to figure out something. What?
Right.
Don't say, they have to look under the bed and check under the carpet.
Absolutely. So, just a couple more questions. I think one is, I thought this worked, and I see that a lot of games don't work well for this. So this is why I mention it. This worked so well to adapt the DC universe to a game, because the attributes are so open-ended that if I wanted to make Superman, and I think like not worry about whether he has power creep or I don't know, he's OP versus the other characters, I know that I could do that. I think you made a smarter episode design choice by having us play more obscure characters. But what are some other types of campaigns or universes, worlds do you think you could do with this?
So I will tell you this as sort of a side note before I answer the actual question.
Yeah.
It was actually harder for me to create these characters than it would have been for me to create brand new characters.
Okay, right on.
Like actually trying to like find a way to and figure out what's important about these characters from the DC universe and figure out what powers they should have in order to get where they are. Some of them like Dagon pretty much was a straight up brand new creation because he's so.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize because I knew Agent Bride was real and
and Dagon is real too, but he literally appeared once in an Aquaman story in 1966.
But see, I love that. I think that's so valid. I mean,
he's got some armor that we don't, and he has the same powers as Mira to create hard water shapes. Okay, and so I had that, and that's easy. But like when it came to some of the more, you guys didn't play Man Bat or his wife She Bat, but they were possible. They were possible characters for you to play too, and those are characters that we've seen a lot of those characters in the comics. A lot of different stories have been told about them, and creating them was actually pretty challenging to figure out. Like, well, what's the important part here?
Yeah, but I would say that, my character, who was kind of like a gun and driving kind of a character, I felt like just as useful and just as keyed into the narrative as, someone who like Nightshade, who can open portals into the dark dimension and do all this kind of like very, miraculous stuff. So, I mean, that's what I thought, for a superhero game, I think that's always the design challenge is how can one of my players play Superman and another one play Batman and they still have a fun experience together.
Right.
And so, I think you did crack that.
Thank you. It's that part is still a work in progress because there's still some balancing issues, and I'm actually there is some tension in my designer brain about just how balanced should these things be, or like if they're exactly balanced, then it kind of doesn't matter what powers you choose, so long as you pick an attack power, pick a defensive power, pick a an investigative power, and you're done. Right, and that's sort of what Champions sort of fell into, because if you go outside the Champions allows you to build any kind of character you like. You can make up brand new powers that's cool, and they've got a great system for this. However, gameplay wise, if you haven't picked an attack power, picked a defensive power, picked a movement power, picked an investigative power, there's going to be moments where you're just not doing anything, and it sucks.
Right. And, well, I think that's really interesting, and because you provided us with characters, I think that's something that should definitely go in the book for this, and maybe even into the character creation rules.
Right, and I make sure that if people didn't do that, would they still have a good time? Like if they were bad at creating characters, could they still have fun? And so I wanted to sort of simplify the character creation process so that it's menus of things, and you could go all in on something. You can make a glass cannon character, but because as you pointed out earlier, the hero traits and the drama traits are really where the character lives.
Right. Like, yeah, because it has a narrative. That's why I think you can't be OP or underpowered in your game, because the characters are helping to control the narrative a little bit. They are creating these story beats for themselves. And that's what kind of balances it all out. Because, I mean, Batman, let's face it, is a character that needs the writer to help him, right? Like, Batman needs the writer to go, I figured out, I wrote down something that Batman could figure out that no one else could figure out. Or, I mean, my favorite example of this is when the Justice League are fighting, I think it's a version of the Injustice Gang, and Batman, as Bruce Wayne, pays for Mirror Master to leave the bad guy team. He pays him off and gets him on his side by just giving him a couple $1 million. So it's like, things like that. I mean, live in the narrative. They don't live on, how much damage or force or, what have you that you can do. So you need a narrative game, almost a story game style RPG for superheroes to make them work.
Yeah, and especially if you're going to do a campaign. I think that's super important if it's a campaign, because then you really want to get into the characters more. You want to get into their lives. You want to find out what, like you want to build that sort of supporting cast of characters around the characters, around the superheroes as well.
Absolutely.
Like a television show about a superhero, and we have lots of those now to draw inspiration from. And so you want to make sure those other characters are important too, even if they're NPCs.
Absolutely. And that's something that I've kind of really only figured out recently, is that if you introduce an NPC, maybe you should bring them back and keep bringing them back. And you shouldn't you shouldn't introduce 100 NPCs. You should introduce 3 important ones and make them, sort of integral to your campaign. There's certain types of campaigns that's more important for, but definitely in the vampire game we're running, you want to bring back people that you introduce because your players and your viewers get to know these people,
That's right. They get to know them, and they either like them or they dislike them, or they have some sort of weird thing with them, and that can be brought back up, and that's just all juicy role-playing, storytelling goodness.
Yeah, it's TV writing 101 too, right? Hey, let's get 2 characters with a history in a room. Right. And guess what? Something interesting will happen. But we don't know that something interesting will happen if a character meets a new person, or is moving from town to town constantly and always meeting new people. We're not positive something interesting will happen. Andy, I have, I think, one more question for you, and then let's bid our viewers goodbye. What do you think this is a big one. What do you think the best role-playing games, or you could even just say games, have in common? All of them.
Okay. They have a clear path for player agency. And so when we talk about player agency, we're talking about the ability to do stuff and to do meaningful stuff, right? To make meaningful choices and have make meaningful changes into the game world, into the game state.
Yeah.
Right? With a video game, and you're playing, and it's a shooter, and basically all you have is the ability to shoot a gun.
Yeah.
You still want to be able to make that meaningful, right? You want to make that. You want to give them meaningful ways of influencing the world through gunplay.
Right.
With superheroes, superheroes can do literally anything. Within the realm of superherodom, what can't be done? Almost nothing.
Right.
And so you want to make sure that the players have and understand how their agency works. Like, what can I do? How will this help me? These need to be questions that come up all the time and get answered very quickly.
Right. And it's surprising how many games, video games, as well, maybe board games sometimes.
A lot of
although board games has less of a problem with this because the gameplay is more front and center. But
you think so, but no.
Yeah, right. How do I make something meaningful happen? Because they're not going to have fun if they're not making something. And meaningful is a tricky word, but if they're not doing something meaningful, something that affects change, they're not going to have fun.
Right.
And there are so many RPG sessions that I have played in and ran where it felt like we did not do anything meaningful, and they weren't that fun.
They weren't that fun, right? And that can happen. That can happen a lot. It happens a lot in board games. Anytime you how many times have you? And so how many times have you had a turn, and at the end of your turn, you're like, well, I don't think I'm any better off now than I was at the beginning of my turn.
Right.
We talk about having null turns. A null turn is that turn where nothing happens. And I'm not able to push my goals any further, or I'm not able to change the board in such a way that's going to benefit me later. It's just a big bleh.
I will run games that I'm proud of where I have a player who spends a lot of time moving from one location to the other while the other players are doing something fun and interesting and affecting to the world. So that is such a hard nut to crack because it's situational too.
It's very situational. And in a role-playing game, it's very, very situational.
Yeah.
In board games, not so much, right? In board games, it's just part of the design of the game. You need to be able to do stuff. It's also in board game design, it's become really, really unpopular for this very reason to have a skip a turn mechanics.
Yeah.
Right? Because how terrible is that? I mean, people have sat down to play a game, and now one of the game mechanics is you don't get to play.
Yeah, I mean, a good rule of thumb would be the opposite. Never skip anybody's turn.
Right. Never skip anybody's turn. Always give them something. In superhero games, the risk is, what about the guy who can freeze you in ice? What about the guy who
Right.
can pace you in stone? What about the guy who can entangle you in web? Like, does that make the game fun? Only if you can actually
Not
try
being entangled in a web is not fun.
if you can do something though,
Right.
then it's okay.
Right.
Then
If I'm tangled up in a web, but I can still use my psychic dagger to, or something like that.
exactly.
Andy, this has been such a great conversation. I always love talking to you. We've played so many games together, and with your wonderful wife Jackie. And you know what? I mean, seriously, having these conversations is so helpful because then I walk off and I go, "Oh yeah, always make sure you're not skipping a turn or you're doing that as little as possible," and it makes my gaming so much better. So thank you so much for sharing your game with us and also for having this conversation with me.
Well, this has been a great pleasure to me too.
We'll have you back. Well, we need to have you as a player sometime.
Yes, please. I would love that.
Okay, great. That's Andy Ashcraft, everybody. His company is called Giantsdance Games. We played his game, the Hero Instant. He's promoted it at Gen Con. Andy has all kinds of games. Look him up online and find them. And I'm going to say goodbye for now, but I want to thank our viewers again for watching. And we've got more lab shows I'm excited about coming up with interviews and fun kind of game scenarios that we're going to play out to kind of look at the mechanics of different games. So, watch Twitter @ Stream of Blood and join our Facebook group, Stream of Blood, to find out about those upcoming games. And later, never skip a turn. Bye.